It was quite a scavenger hunt to get that one a few minutes ago.
Last time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it was Jay Whitmore. Someone, one of the ushers found one there.
Oh, yeah.
You were laughing how hard it was to find
I know.
a hard copy Bible.
That feels weird to say. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Appreciate everyone being here. We're going to pick up in Acts 22 if you want to turn there in your Bibles. Derek and I were just talking about how it's kind of weird. It's hard to find a physical Bible sometimes. I use my computer and my phone so much that last time I thought I got here and I was like, I don't actually have my physical copy. So I promised myself I was going to have it today. I left it on my desk. So Derek saved me again. So I actually have the text this time in the slides. I didn't before, but we'll be able to go through that and see that on the screen. So let's start with a prayer, and then we'll jump into the passage for today. God, we thank you for our time together today to just be together and to share some time in the Word and to worship you and praise you. We ask that your blessing would be on this time that we have together. We thank you for the life of Paul and the many things that we learned from him. And I pray that something about the text today would enlighten us and humble us and help us to draw nearer to you. Thank you for how much Paul desired to be like Jesus, and I pray that we will as well. In Jesus' name, amen. I wasn't able to be here last week, so there could be a few things that overlap from what Derek covered. But one thing I wanted to mention from a few weeks ago, actually it was quite a while. I think I taught one of the classes and then we had all the snow and the ice, and so we kept getting interrupted. So it's been quite a while. But one thing I wanted to mention that I can't remember if I said last time was something that stood out to me, and then we'll kind of segue into today's text. Something that stood out to me from last time when we were looking, I think, maybe in Acts 19, somewhere around there, where I noticed that Paul really showed up as a pastor, as a shepherd. He was, encouraging the Ephesian elders to be shepherds. He wasn't talking to them about being great orators or great teachers. He was encouraging them to be shepherds. And Paul really demonstrated that by every time he went to stop somewhere at these young churches and visit them, and as he went on his travels, he would take time to encourage them and pray with them. And as we talked about previously, you could really see the deep connections that he made with them as they, broke down into tears and they prayed, so fervently as he was leaving, heading toward Jerusalem. And that just kind of struck me the deep relationships that he formed and how real that was. It wasn't just about Paul being some authority figure, the person in charge that everybody looks up to. He really cared for those churches, especially because they were young. And so as we enter into this text today, I guess I want that idea of Pastor Paul, Shepherd Paul, to be in our minds, because this is a person who really loves the church. He loves the people of the church. So here's our text, and right before this, let's see, in chapter 22, this is where Paul shares about his upbringing, and I want to talk a little bit more about him being a Jew, and he talks about his experience with Jesus on the road to Damascus. So then we'll pick up in verse 22, and the part where I guess he lost his audience. He was talking about his experience with Jesus, and the part where he lost them was verse 21, where it says, "And he said to me, go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles." So the Jews at that point didn't want to have anything to do with what Paul was saying, and so verse 22 says, "Up to this word they listened to him." So then they weren't ready to hear anymore, and they kind of interrupted his speech there. So let's pick up there, and I'll read for just a little bit. "Up to this word they listened to him. Then they raised their voices and said, 'Away with such a fellow from the earth, for he should not be allowed to live.' And as they were shouting and throwing off their cloaks and flinging dust into the air," let's see. There we go. Yeah. "The tribune ordered him to be brought into the barracks, saying that he should be examined by flogging to find out why they were shouting against him like this. But when they had stretched him out for the whips, Paul said to the centurion who was standing by, 'Is it lawful for you to flog a man who is a Roman citizen and uncondemned?' When the centurion heard this, he went to the tribune and said to him, 'What are you about to do? For this man is a Roman citizen.' So the tribune came and said to him, 'Tell me, are you a Roman citizen?' And he said, 'Yes.' The tribune answered, 'I bought this citizenship for a large sum.' Paul said, 'But I am a citizen by birth.' So those who were about to examine him withdrew from him immediately. And the tribune also was afraid, for he realized that Paul was a Roman citizen and that he had bound him. But on the next day, desiring to know the real reason why he was being accused by the Jews, he unbound him and commanded the chief priests and all the council to meet, and he brought Paul down and set him before them." So before we move on to the next section, as we kind of go through that passage there, again, if you've got it open up in your own Bible, what are some things that you notice in this text about what happens, or what are a few things that might stand out to you?
Yeah, I've always thought it was strange he waited so long to tell him he was a Roman citizen. He was already strung out, tied down. If I'm reading that right. But he played the card, but it seemed to me he played a good play.
Yeah, I think perhaps the reason he waited a little while was at least to get away from the Jews. He wanted to play that Roman card in front of a Gentile audience and not a Jewish audience. Perhaps. That's just a thought. Anybody else? What did you notice in the text there, at least about what happened or what Paul said about himself?
Or why he felt like he had to buy citizenship.
I thought that was the tribune who said that. Yeah, the tribune answered, verse 28, I bought this citizenship for a large sum, and then Paul said, but I am a citizen by birth.
You know, it's kind of interesting that they bought it. I mean, that he said it and they believed it. Now you have to prove 14 pieces of identification and all that. And, I mean, you know, that he said it. Okay, you are, and we can't touch you.
Yeah,
You know, that has always seemed ironic to me.
yeah, and he says for a large sum, so this was an expensive thing to,
Yeah, I'm talking Paul though.
Oh, you mean
Yeah, I'm talking
Paul, okay.
You know, yeah, when Paul said, I'm a citizen, you know, can you beat me? And they just believed it. He said, I mean, how did they know he was wrong?
yeah, could be that some of what we see here is condensed. You know, Paul's speech, Paul's words may be condensed, the text may be condensed, and so we may not see every part of that. There may have been a way for Paul to prove that.
There was also a pretty significant penalty in that era if you claim to be a Roman citizen.
Okay.
Not that if you're about to get whipped,
That might take.
I mean, that's like, but they did try to discourage it, the Romans did.
I find it strange that the Jews were so quickly going from listening to what someone had to say to, he makes one statement, he's going to be going, giving his message to the Gentiles, and turning on him so vehemently and saying he should die because he's telling, he's going to go to the Gentiles. I guess they feel the Gentiles weren't worthy of receiving the message, or I don't quite understand. We see today there's lots of political rhetoric that influence people to the negative.
Yeah.
But it doesn't seem to justify their reaction to what we have.
I personally think they were just starting to view Paul as a traitor, and perhaps because of what had been said about him before. I think, again, Derek may have mentioned this last Sunday or previously. There's a section in the text a few chapters ago where Paul's accused of bringing some Gentiles into the temple, but he doesn't necessarily do that. So there's all these things surrounding him that people are accusing him of, and kind of like unhitching from, you know, Moses and the law and the Torah, all this stuff. And I think for the Jewish people, this was a very like deep identity thing, you know, that Paul was taking them away from their identity, which he actually wasn't, and we can hopefully talk about that more in a moment. But yeah, I think their reaction when he just, you know, mentions that about the Gentiles, that does seem like an extreme reaction. And I think I've got this in my notes, but you know, this is very similar to what happens with Jesus, right? This kind of echoes what happens with Jesus, the progression of people not trusting him and thinking that he's trying to say negative things about Moses and the law, and then eventually, you know, people viewing him as a threat, and then, you know, let's kill him, you know, because earlier they said take him away, and then I think this time they say away with him, like to be killed, right? So yeah, it is really intense at this point, and I think it mirrors or echoes again what happens with Jesus. Does anybody else have any thoughts about that?
Paul was one of these guys. I mean, before he had the thing on the road to Damascus, he was going and arresting and killing.
Yeah.
So he understood their motives better than anybody, I think.
Yeah, and I also think that he really tried hard to use that to connect with them, but it didn't work very well. He tried to connect to their past, but yeah, once they heard about the reaching out to the Gentiles, they could not see that as a part of their identity moving forward.
Well, he's also talking to two different groups. He's talking to Jews who are not believers in Jesus, but he's also, there are plenty of Jews there who are believers in Jesus. And neither one of those groups in this instance wants to hear the Gentiles invited in. So he's kind of lacking any allies, even the believing Jews are having problems with him, because they think he's gone too far over. So even the ones that believe in Jesus think that he's abandoned Jewishness.
Right. And I think there are a couple of verses in Acts that mention, even some of the Pharisees believed, or some of the priests believed. And at one point that stood out to me because, I don't know, I always put Pharisees in this category of bad, like, Jesus is the good guy and the Pharisees are the bad guys. That's not really true. That's not always the case, and something I'll try to hopefully unpack in a moment is that Paul talks about being a Pharisee. And so yeah, that's kind of an interesting thing that some of them are believers. And I think one of the mistakes, so it's kind of like the coin is flipped. So for them, even those who did believe in Jesus, they were concerned about their Jewishness, their heritage, their identity, and losing that somehow because of what Paul was teaching and because of the person of Jesus. And on our side of it, I think we've sort of abandoned the Jewishness of Paul and Jesus, and we're afraid of that. So that they were afraid of Jesus and Paul, and we're kind of afraid of the Jews or Judaism or the Old Testament. So there's kind of it's kind of a weird exchange there that's happened over time, and I think that will be a little bit clearer when Paul talks in chapter 23 here of some of the things that he says. Any other thoughts about what you noticed from those last few verses about what happens or what Paul says?
Being flogged for information, verse 24, I wondered about throughout Scripture and it not being documented of men and women needing to be done in such a way to have them speak. And it's just not documented, but it was all in regards to what God wanted.
You're saying how many other times that may have happened that we just don't even know about?
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or women.
Yeah, and it is, I mean, for me personally, it's hard for me to even kind of comprehend what Paul's experienced in this flogging, kind of like with Jesus. Like sometimes the crucifixion story, I kind of become a little bit numb to it because I don't really understand what Jesus experienced. And this probably sounds silly, but I feel like I'm watching sort of like a CIA movie here, like where they're trying to get to the bottom of what's going on, and they brought Paul in, he's on the chair, and they're interrogating him, and I've watched too many shows like that recently, but like even in these moments where I watch something on TV, and like I saw some show the other day where they pulled the guy's fingernail out to get him to talk. I mean, I just can't imagine the pain that people go through. So the fact that Paul is being, like you said, flogged and beaten here, and then we'll see in a moment where that even happens from the high priest. He gets hit in the mouth, I think. He gets struck on the mouth. I mean, this is just hard to relate to. Like, I just have never had an experience like this, so.
For background information, information may not be out there that you know. They refer to sex in the Jews various times, various sects. And we know there's Sadducees and Pharisees. I don't know whether there were other groups or not, there probably were. But is there any indication of which groups were more likely or more prevalent in the conversion to Christianity? Which one of those groups?
I would think the Pharisees.
Because the Sadducees didn't believe in the resurrection.
Right, that's what I was about to say. Because of chapter 23, I would think that the Pharisees would be much more inclined to become believers because of their kind of long tradition of a hope of resurrection, even if that wasn't in the person of Jesus, which is ultimately what the crux of all of this is about, is that they did believe in resurrection. They just didn't necessarily believe that it had showed up in the person of Jesus Christ. So yeah, that's what I would think. Anybody else have a thought on that? I don't want it to be a situation where someone brings up something and then I answer it and like, that's it. That's just my thought that comes to mind.
I did have a question.
Sure.
Why did they throw out their cloaks and throw dust in the air?
Yeah, this sounds terrible, but I was actually kind of laughing about that earlier because it's a very serious thing, but in my mind, just like envisioning them doing that, I'd be like, what are y'all doing? But it was a way of expressing their disgust and how offended they were by what was being, said by Paul. So, there are others.
Wait till Tuesday night, you watch the State of the Union, and you'll see
Oh.
silly stuff being done.
Yeah. So yeah, again, the disconnect in culture, maybe not completely, but the disconnect in culture is kind of weird there. But yeah, that was sort of a traditional way of them demonstrating their disapproval and offense.
Not just hiding in the dust.
Not just hiding in the dust? No, I don't think so. All right. Anybody else have a thought about this part of the text? I think I've got a couple of observations here. Paul has appealed to his Roman citizenship before. If you recall in chapter 16, this is the story with the Philippian jailer, and verse 35, but when it was day, the magistrates sent the police saying, let those men go. And the jailer reported these words to Paul saying, the magistrates have sent to let you go, therefore come out now and go in peace. But Paul said to them, they have beaten us publicly, uncondemned men who are Roman citizens, and have thrown us into prison. And do they now throw us out secretly? No, let them come themselves and take us out. The police reported these words to the magistrates. They were afraid when they heard that they were Roman citizens. So they came and apologized to them, and they took them out and asked them to leave the city. So they went out of the prison and visited Lydia. When they had seen the brothers, they encouraged them and departed. So Paul has used this approach before. And by the way, one of the things I mentioned last time was that because Paul is following Jesus, then he is walking toward a life of suffering. But at the same time, Paul is going to, be logical at times and not just ask for punishment. He's going to try to get out of situations if he can. And so I think this is from Cicero, to bind a Roman citizen is a crime. To flog him, an abomination. To slay him is almost an act of murder. So this was a very serious thing, and so that's why in chapter 22, just like in chapter 16, they really wanted to make sure that they were not breaking the law. And I guess to an extent they already had, so they were trying to get out of this situation. The very fact that they had bound Paul, I think they were already breaking the law.
What Kelly was saying before.
About proving his citizenship?
Well, him waiting.
Oh, yeah.
Because when we studied chapter 16 way back when, we talked some about speculating why Paul does this, because he is beaten there before 80. So it's it's after the fact. He's like, you realize you beat a Roman citizen, and there are writers who think he's part of a different kingdom now, right? He's inviting other people into God's kingdom, and so to walk around with the little "Hello, my name is Roman citizen" tag might have been because a lot of these Jewish people, diaspora Jews or in Jerusalem, would not have been citizens, and so that marker as being a Roman citizen might have been a real separation between him and a lot of the people he's ministering to.
Yes.
So it's the kind of thing you might not just say first thing. obviously he doesn't. He waits a long time there that first time, and then even now he's strung out, about to get beaten before he says it.
Right. Those are good points,
So
yeah.
it's an idea.
I said this earlier, but Paul's experience of suffering echoes back to Jesus. We can see a lot of similarities in what's said here, and he even brings up, I can't remember if it's in chapter 22, but he brings up Stephen. So, I mean, the same things are happening to Stephen, or to Jesus, to Stephen, to Paul, in their trials and sufferings and eventually their deaths. All right, here's the second part of the passage, and this is chapter 23, verse 1. So that last verse there of chapter 22, they were desiring to know the real reason why he was being accused by the Jews. He unbound him, commanded the chief priests and all the council to meet, and he brought Paul down and set him before them. So he's brought Paul before the priests, the Jewish leaders. Verse 1, and looking intently at the council, Paul said, brothers, I have lived my life before God in all good conscience up to this day. And the high priest Ananias commanded those who stood by him to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. Are you sitting to judge me according to the law, and yet contrary to the law you order me to be struck? Those who stood by said, would you revile God's high priest? And Paul said, I did not know, brothers, that he was the high priest, for it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. Now when Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, he cried out in the council, brothers, I am a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. It is with respect to the hope and the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial. And when he had said this, a dissension arose between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. For the Sadducees said there is no resurrection, nor angel, nor spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledged them all. Then a great clamor arose, and some of the scribes of the Pharisees' party stood up and contended sharply, we find nothing wrong in this man. What if a spirit or an angel spoke to him? And when the dissension became violent, the tribune, afraid that Paul would be torn to pieces by them, commanded the soldiers to go down and take him away from among them by force and bring him into the barracks. The following night, the Lord stood by him and said, take courage, for as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must testify also in Rome. So that's the rest of our text for today. What do you notice in this part of the passage, or what stands out to you?
There's a reason why we don't feel comfortable thinking about that, or talking about that.
I think Paul's referring to what he had done previously when he was persecuting Christians, that he did it because he thought it was the right thing.
Right? What about the fact that he didn't know, or he said he didn't know who the high priest was? So he speaks pretty intensely to him, says some really strong words, and then they say in verse 4, let's see, would you revile God's high priest? And Paul's like, brothers, I didn't know. How did he not know?
How long this particular high priest and Ananias been the high priest would be one question, I guess. And then, obviously, the high priest in everyday life didn't dress distinctly different.
Yeah, that's kind of what was coming to my mind, maybe, yeah. But it just sounds kind of weird, like Paul saying, I'm a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees, like, oh, you're the high priest? I didn't know. But yeah.
He'd been traveling.
Right, yeah.
I find it kind of interesting that the the greatest insult he could call the guy was a whitewashed wall.
Mm.
I think I could come up with something better than that.
Yeah, man, there's a lot of things popping in my head. So, yeah, I'll come back to what you said, but what you were saying about, him being in regular clothing, I don't think this was a standard or regular meeting. This wasn't a typical meeting, so I don't think they would have been maybe in the positions they would have, like seated in where they would normally be seated, clothed like that. So yeah, I think the confusion could have come from that. But to your point about what he called him, it reminds me of Jesus referring to the Pharisees as whitewashed tombs and speaking to his hypocrisy, which I read a little bit about this particular guy. Let's see if I've got a note on this here. I'll go ahead and jump to it.
Sounds a little bit like something John Baptist might say.
Yeah.
I've seen the whitewashed walls actually used in multiple times as the coverage of a rotten core, rotten unstable foundation. Even Jesus makes a notion to it in Matthew 23:27.
Yeah.
The Pharisees as whitewashed tombs.
Tombs, yeah. Right. But I thought I had a note up here about it, but I don't. What I was going to say is that Josephus talks about Ananias being a very greedy, power-hungry, violent person, and so eventually he does get murdered. And so I guess in a way what Paul says is a prophetic statement, and I don't know, perhaps he knew more about the high priest than he was letting on, but he did speak to his hypocrisy for sure. What else do you notice?
Well, just the comment, you shall not speak evil to the ruler of your people.
Mm-hmm.
I guess does that apply to our presidents and politicians today? Not
No, it
specific-
doesn't.
Not
It
specifically
doesn't
the law,
apply.
no, but it's the heart of it. But it's the heart of it.
Yeah.
Might be the question.
Is there any sense that Paul might be being sarcastic with some of this? I mean, because we talked, part of the reason, that the crowd, finally goes crazy, and the Romans have to get Paul away from the crowd, like in the previous chapter. We mentioned last week, everything going on for the Jews with the Roman Empire being there for, generations now, the frustration and the influx of Gentiles, but part of it was also the corruption of the priesthood that, your average, everyday Jew is just mad about because they're all in cahoots with the Romans. And so here's Paul, I didn't know you were the high priest, because you don't act like the high priest. Is there any, and I don't know, it doesn't explicitly say that, but I don't think it's hard to read that into it. And maybe Paul is not just saying, I had no idea, maybe he's giving a little jab there to the high priest, because the high priest is not acting like the high priest.
Yeah.
He's a really evil guy.
I think something that stands out to me sort of in a personal way is I remember when I was pretty young and my grandfather gave me some tapes, like debate tapes of different church leaders talking about whatever. And I was trying to study something at the time that was confusing me. And I remember the two debaters getting very heated and making these personal attacks at each other. And at the time, it just really shocked me how vicious they got. And so what stands out to me here in the text is when these Jewish people feel threatened by their theology and their thinking, how they understand God and what their role is, instead of talking through it, they immediately become so violent. And even the high priest himself when Paul says that here, I live my life before God in all good conscience up to this day, he commands them to strike him on the mouth. And immediately it goes to violence. And that just really stands out to me as something, I guess, sad and sort of still shocking to me in a way. And so Paul, I guess being, I don't know what all's going on with him with the sarcasm and what he knows and stuff like that, but I think Paul probably might lose his temper a little bit here. I think I would. Got hit in the mouth really hard, and I've gone through all this. I think I would get angry and kind of snap at this leader, this person, whoever it was. And so it's interesting to me that Paul says something so harsh, but yet true, perhaps, about him. And then when they speak up, let's see. When they speak up, would you revile God's high priest? When I guess when they put it in perspective like that, Paul backs off and he said, and notice again, he calls them brothers. He's like, I didn't know that he was the high priest. You shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. And he immediately kind of goes back to this humble posture. So I just think that interaction is interesting. I don't necessarily have a deeper point there, but the jump to violence and then Paul recognizing what they're saying and him kind of taking a step back was just interesting to me. Any thoughts about that?
I was going to mention what you just pointed out. He calls them brothers, at least
Yeah.
twice. And I don't know if that's just general greeting or if there's something more to it than that. But it seems like he starts to try to redirect the focus from himself. He says, I'm on trial for my hope of the resurrection. So it's really not about me. It's about you two groups. And that's when it all goes
Yeah.
crazy. So I don't know if that's his way to try to get out of this or if that was strategic or if that just happened that way. But I find it interesting.
Yeah.
I think he's really good at just saying everything he needs to say, and then knowing, tapping into the politics of the day, knowing when to take the attention from himself to help others.
Yeah.
Like he took it all the way up to those people who were ready to kill him, and then he knew what to say to get out of the situation.
Yeah.
So,
Right. Yeah. I think he's smart, like you said. I think he's also, aware, and he's being true to himself, because something I was going to point out, let me see if I've got this here. Yeah, Paul says, I am a Pharisee. If you look back in chapter 22, okay, I might be mistaken about this. Verse 3 of 22 says, I am a Jew. I was reading that earlier, and I think I was thinking about him saying, I was born in Tarsus, brought up, like this is who I was. But here in front of them, he says, I am a Pharisee. So this wasn't my past life, and now I'm a follower of Jesus. Like, Paul is a devout Jew. He is a practicing Pharisee. He goes to the temple. He participates in vows. He participates in temple worship. He is a Jew. And at the same time, he is a follower of Jesus. And there's no conflict there. So to me, that really stands out, and it goes back to what I was talking about before, that the Jews were fearful of where Paul might be leading them away from the Torah, when in reality, Paul was trying to take them to the fulfillment of the Torah through Jesus. So their fear, the Jews were afraid of where Jesus was going, and as Jesus followers, I think sometimes we're kind of afraid of Judaism and the Old Testament and the law. But I'm not as bothered as I used to be to think about Paul being a Jew and a Pharisee and a disciple of Jesus. Those things are all true. And he's a faithful Jew, and he's a faithful, I guess we could say Christian. I don't know that Paul would use that word. It's just not part of his language, but a disciple of Jesus. So sometimes I think people perhaps misunderstand what Paul says, particularly in Galatians, where it may sound like he's opposed to the law, but he's speaking to Gentiles. And then in Romans, Paul sounds like he's in favor of the law, but he's speaking to Jews. And I don't think there's really a conflict there, but I do think it's important for us to note that Paul was able to participate in the Jewish customs and traditions and participate in the Torah and still be a follower of Jesus. And that expectation was on Jews, but not Gentiles. He didn't expect that of Gentiles. Anybody have any thoughts about that?
It's interesting to think about the diversity that existed in the first century church, because there was a lot.
True. And how much they had to deal with that. I mean, Paul speaks of that a lot in his writings about unity and with the Jews and Gentiles. Of course, that was extremely challenging. Any other thoughts about the text? I can back up and look at that. Yeah, again, when the dissension became violent, so this wasn't just a disagreement or a debate. It so quickly became violent. The tribune, afraid that Paul would be torn to pieces by them, commanded the soldiers to go down and take him away from among them by force and bring him into the barracks.
It seems that violence was really a part of Jewish culture, and really of the Jewish law. If you think about all the ways, the reasons you can be put to death. And, we are Christians, and that is our culture. And it's hard culture of violence like they had. Their go-to was for their own people who they disagreed with. Well, we're going to kill you.
Yeah.
And you often hear that Jesus came at just the right time, the right political situation, the right time in history. And you think about if the Romans weren't there, they weren't the occupying force. I mean, they just killed Paul. They'd done it probably a long time ago. But the Romans are there to actually stop them from doing that. And so even though Paul suffers at the hands of Romans, he's not killed.
Yeah. Because they do want peace and order. The Romans do. In general, for their society, yeah. That's a good point. I wanted to mention that there are 3 visions mentioned in this section. I mean, it includes earlier in chapter 22, but in 22:6, where Paul starts to talk about his experience with Jesus on the road to Damascus, sort of that resurrection appearance. And then in 22:18, when I returned to Jerusalem and was praying in the temple, I fell into a trance. And again, Paul's Jewishness, he's praying in the temple. So, you can't really deny that about Paul. But when he's in the temple praying, I mean, God wasn't afraid to join him at the temple. It's kind of a joke. But he fell into a trance and saw him saying to me, "Make haste and get out of Jerusalem quickly, because they will not accept your testimony about me." So he encounters him in this resurrection appearance that he refers back to. The warning in 22:18 And then this encouragement in 23:11, and I think that's a really neat verse here, verse 11 of chapter 23, where it says, "The following night, the Lord stood by him," and that kind of gives me like this picture of people from the Old Testament, prophets of old, you know, leaders of God's people, kings, warriors, and God being there beside them. The Lord stood by him and said, "Take courage, for as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so must you testify also in Rome." So Paul wanted to get to Rome, and Jesus tells him that that's going to be the case, but it just stands out to me here that Jesus encourages Paul, like in this really difficult, painful time for him. That night the Lord appeared to him or came to him and stood by him and said, "Take courage, you know, don't give up, don't lose your hope. There's still more for you to do." So has that verse ever stood out to y'all before? Because I think in my neglect of the end of Acts, I haven't really paid much attention to it. But I think it's powerful, and it's just kind of surprising to see that Jesus appeared in that way to him to encourage him.
I have wondered if, you know, before he gets to Jerusalem, he's warned everywhere he goes. And by the Holy Spirit, it says, so I thought, well, is this Paul saying, well, I'm going to do this, I don't care? Or was this God's plan? And God's telling the people around him. But this says, you know, he tells them, you're going to go to Rome. And so it seems like you might, and not just you are going to go, you must testify also in Rome.
Yeah.
So you can see God's plan in it, even though he was warned again and again, this is going to happen.
Yeah, I think I brought up something about how when he kept being warned, I didn't really think, again, this is just me personally, that there was a conflict with what the Spirit was saying. Like he was telling some people, like the Spirit was telling some people, Paul shouldn't go. Paul doesn't need to go. Be sure you tell him that. And then to Paul, he was saying, hey, you need to go. And so he was like, wait, what are you telling me here? I think it was the same message that he was going to suffer. And so they didn't want him to go, but he knew that he needed to or that he had to. Does that make any sense?
Like you said, Paul loved these people, so they loved him too.
Right,
When
right.
they went to him, it's like, the Spirit told me that you're gonna suffer, please don't go.
Right.
They added their humanity.
Yeah. And it was kind of like that Peter Jesus moment too, where Jesus is talking about his crucifixion, and Peter's like, no, you can't do this. And Jesus has to say, you know, get behind me, Satan. Like you're not going to get in the way of God's plan, God's purposes.
I think it also just here, the way Judy put it, it reminded me, and it's a very different situation, but on the second missionary journey when they're wandering aimlessly for a couple hundred miles in what's now Turkey before they get the Macedonian call to cross over into Greece. And they really were kind of directionless. The Spirit had prevented them from going where they thought they could go in Turkey.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, so it just seemed like, what was the thought there about, just where they were headed. And then they get this supernatural, this Macedonian call. And so here the same thing, right? All of a sudden he's in jail. Like you could really sense that most people would wonder, okay, what's next? Because this seems to be real, kind of block to me going wherever I want to. And all of a sudden, kind of this gives him, the vision to know exactly where he's going to wind up and where he's supposed to go. Give him authority to speak. I mean, there's a lot that happens between now and when he gets to Rome. Mm-hmm. But he goes through it all knowing that he's going to wind up there.
And I think what you said kind of reminds me of, again, that it's appropriate to call this like like Acts is about the acts of the Spirit or the acts of God. It's not simply the acts of the apostles, because half the time they don't know where to go or what to do, and the Spirit is saying in different ways, yes, go here, don't go here, do this, and it just shows that that God is really the main character in the story. He's the one moving the story forward. So it's not, simply the apostles, but it's the Spirit coming after Jesus. And yeah. There was one other thing I wanted to point out. Let me see if I can remember here. I think I just wanted to end by restating that I think thinking about the Jewishness of Jesus and the Jewishness of Paul is worth our consideration, because I think there's just been a fear associated with I don't know if fear is the right word, maybe just a discomfort with the law and it almost being like a bad thing. But Paul talks about the law as something that he delights in, and that's how the Hebrew scriptures speak of the Torah and of the law, that it's something that is good. And Jesus, I think, speaks well of the law. And so I don't want it to be lost on us here that, when Paul's going through all this, it's very likely that him being a Jewish man, being a devout Pharisee, maybe he had phylacteries hanging off of him, and he was in the full Jewish garb. This is not, necessarily someone who's been stripped away from all of that, and you can't really tell. He's in the full Jewish wardrobe, as it were, when all these things are happening, and as he's saying all this, because he is, as he says, a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. So I think it's just important for us to not lose that. But yeah, that's all I've got for today, and I appreciate y'all's attention and your responses, and hope you have a great week. Get a longer cord. This one goes with this charger. It's not the original cord with it, but it's for laptops. But it's just not. It's not. I mean, it's not super short, but it's not super long. Oh, sorry about the waddle. Can't believe that happened. What translation do you use? Or is that?
This is a ESV.
ESV. Okay.
At work, I have an NIV that I've had for 1,000 years. It's falling apart. At home, I have the good RSV, study Bible that I use.
Yeah, I think I would have noticed that it was something different if it seemed a little bit unusual to me. But yeah, I didn't even notice. So ESV is what I use a lot too. Yeah. Oh.
Probably not even for like